West Virginia, autumn 1874. You hear the church bell first, a single toll drawn out and metallic, cutting through the cold morning air, then the silence, the kind that doesn't feel natural. The Weaver family had not been in the mountain town of Elkhorn for long when they began to notice him. A boy no taller than your waist, standing just beyond the graveyard fence, in the fog, staring at the church windows long after evening service had ended. His eyes did not move when you approached, but the air did. As if the mountain wind shifted only around him, no one in the congregation claimed to know him. Not the preacher, not the widows who had lived here since before the Civil War, not even the grave digger. Yet each Sunday there he stood, coat buttoned to the chin, pale as chalk, hair dark as coal dust, and always those eyes. Some said he was the last son of the Weaver bloodline. Others swore he was no son at all but a remnant. When the sheriff tried to follow him into the hills, he returned at dawn with torn clothes and a look that emptied his face of all human certainty. He resigned the next day. And if you had been in Elkhorn in October of 1874, you would have heard the old women whisper the same thing they whispered to one another for decades afterward. That boy ain't from here, and the ones who try to find out where he is from don't come back right. The Weaver family arrived in Elkhorn at the end of summer 1874 with the same heavy wooden wagon they had used to leave two other towns that year. No one knew where their money came from. Mr. Weaver claimed he was a surveyor, but never once was he seen with a compass or a map. They rented a weathered clapboard house on the hill, the one that faced the steeple. Its shutters hung loose and the porch sagged in the middle, but Mrs. Weaver cleaned it as if preparing for someone important. Yet no one ever visited. The townsfolk of Elkhorn believed in manners, tight-lipped smiles, cordial greetings, but they had an instinct for keeping distance. Shopkeepers would wrap the Weavers' purchases quickly, never asking after the children. Neighbors would nod, but never linger. There was a reason. The Appalachian hills kept their own kind of memory, and Elkhorn was old enough to have buried secrets no railroad would ever reach. The elders had seen families like the Weavers before, outsiders with a certain hunger in their eyes, carrying something invisible but heavy enough to change the air when they passed. Within days, the town's children began telling stories. They said Thomas Weaver, the youngest boy, didn't speak in his own voice, that if you caught him alone, his words came in a slow, old-fashioned dialect none of them recognized, that he knew names of people buried in the churchyard before he had ever stepped foot inside it. When the preacher's wife, Mrs. Whittle, asked him one afternoon where he'd learned such things, Thomas had simply looked at her and said, "I hear them from the ones who stay in the ground." She fainted before she could answer. It was late October when the first boy went missing. Caleb Dunn was 14, all elbows and long legs, the kind of farm kid who could run the ridge trails faster than most grown men. He was last seen in the creek bed below the churchyard, chasing a blackbird with one wing broken. By sundown, his parents sent a search party. Lanterns swung in the darkness, men shouted his name into the hollows. The sound didn't carry right, that night voices seemed to disappear into the mist before echoing back. When they reached the bend where the creek met the tree line, they found Caleb's boots neatly placed side by side in the mud. No footprints beyond them, no sign of a struggle, just the sound of running water. And some swore the faint sound of a boy's laughter from somewhere deep in the trees. The next morning, Mrs. Dunn came pounding on the Weaver's door. She swore she had seen Thomas at the edge of their pasture, standing barefoot in the frost, looking straight at her window. He didn't run when she called his name. He didn't blink. The sheriff, the same one who would later vanish himself, questioned Thomas in front of his parents. The boy's face was blank, but his hands were trembling. "I didn't take him," he whispered. "He's just gone where the others went." When pressed, Thomas would not name the others. He simply repeated a phrase that chilled even the hardest men in the room. "Sometimes the hill calls us. Sometimes we have to answer." Caleb Dunn was never found. But in the nights that followed, his mother claimed she heard his boots walking across her porch. In the weeks after Caleb Dunn vanished, the Sunday sermons in Elkhorn took on a strange tone. Reverend Whittle, usually a steady voice in the pulpit, began preaching less about salvation and more about holding fast against temptations that walk on two legs. He never named Thomas Weaver outright, but no one missed the implication. Yet there was something more disturbing than his choice of words. He never once prayed for Caleb's safe return. The older congregants noticed it first. How the Reverend would pause when certain scripture verses came up, skipping lines that spoke of the dead rising or the earth giving up her buried. And each time Thomas entered the church, sitting quiet in the last pew, Reverend Whittle's voice would falter, like a man forcing himself not to look at something in the corner of his vision. It was in the church basement, the cold stone room where they kept the baptismal robes, that Mrs. Whittle was overheard whispering to her husband. "You know what he is," she hissed. "You've read the old ledger. It's happening again." The old ledger became a topic of hushed speculation. Some said it was a church record older than the building itself, written in a hand so spidery you could barely read it. Others claimed it was no church record at all, but something smuggled into the town decades before the Civil War, a binding, not a chronicle. Whatever it was, the Reverend kept it locked in the small iron cabinet behind his office desk. And from that Sunday forward, he made sure to bolt the church doors earlier than usual, even before the last parishioners had finished their goodbyes. Meanwhile, Thomas Weaver never missed a service. And though he never sang the hymns, his lips moved, forming words no one could hear. The Reverend kept the iron cabinet key on a thin leather cord around his neck. No one was meant to touch it, not even Mrs. Whittle, but on a storm-soaked Thursday night in November, the church roof sprang a leak, and the Reverend left to fetch tarps from the supply shed. Mrs. Whittle, alone in the office, heard the wind battering the shutters and almost without thinking reached for the key. The ledger inside was older than any Bible she had seen. Its leather cover was cracked like dry skin, its spine warped with moisture from years before. The pages were uneven, their edges browned and curling. Some entries were written in a language she couldn't place, thick, looping characters that looked almost like vines. But in the back half of the book, the words shifted to English. The first name she recognized stopped her cold. Thomas Weaver, born 1874, found in the hollow near Cradle's End, marked, "Keep away from running water." Beneath the name, in smaller writing, was a date, 1792. Her mind stumbled over it. That was 82 years before the boy was born. And yet there was a final note written in a sharper, darker ink. "He comes back the same." A sudden draft slammed the office door shut. Mrs. Whittle nearly dropped the ledger, shoving it back into the cabinet and locking it just as the Reverend returned. His face, when he saw her hands near the key, drained of all color. He did not scold her. He simply said, in a voice flat and low, "If you value your place in God's light, you will never open that book again." She never told him she'd already read the name. Cradle's End wasn't on any county map. You had to know which deer trail to take, which ridge to cross, and which bend in the river to follow until the water turned slow and black. Only the oldest hunters spoke of it, and even then, only after whiskey. It was there, in a shallow, bowl-shaped hollow choked with laurel and moss, that Thomas Weaver was said to have been found. Not born, not brought, found. The Reverend's ledger gave no details beyond the word marked, but the hills carried their own records. Men who had stumbled upon Cradle's End told the same uneasy story. The air there was wrong. It hung heavy, damp, and cold even in August. Birds would not sing there. Sometimes in the stillness you could hear what sounded like children's voices beneath the ground, not speaking, not crying, just humming. One hunter swore he'd seen shallow depressions in the soil shaped like ribs, too large to be from any animal. Another claimed he had stepped into one of the hollows and felt something give way beneath his boots, something soft, but not alive, and always in the center of the clearing was the stone. It jutted up from the earth like a crude altar, slick with lichen, carved with patterns no one could read. On its flat surface there were faint scratches, almost erased by time. Those who got close enough to trace them said the marks felt burned into the rock rather than cut. The locals believed Cradle's End was older than the town, older than the church, maybe older than the mountains themselves. Thomas Weaver never spoke about it, but he was seen there once standing beside the stone in the pouring rain, his hand pressed flat against it, eyes closed as if listening. Sure, if Amos Caldwell was not the kind of man who believed in old mountain talk. He'd fought in the war, buried men by the dozen, and seen what real fear looked like. But when Caleb Dunn vanished and the whispers about Thomas Weaver began, he found himself waking in the night with the boy's words in his head, Sometimes the hill calls us. By the first frost, Caldwell had made up his mind. If the weavers wouldn't explain, he'd find the truth himself. He left before sunrise one morning, riding north toward the ridge. Witnesses said they saw him stop near the churchyard, staring at the boy from across the fence. Thomas never moved, just watched him go. That night, Caldwell's horse returned to town without its rider. The saddle was torn and the leather reins were wet, but not with rainwater. When the search party followed the trail, they found it led toward Cradle's End. The prints grew erratic, doubling back on themselves as if the sheriff had been chasing something or being chased. At the edge of the hollow, they found his hat, crushed into the mud. Beside it was his revolver fully loaded. No body, no sign of struggle, only the sound of that same low humming, curling up from the ground like heat from a stove. The men did not stay long enough to investigate further. The next Sunday, Thomas Weaver was in church as always, sitting in the last pew. When the reverend began the opening hymn, the boy leaned forward and whispered to the man in front of him, Caldwell's cousin. He didn't answer quick enough. The man left before the service was over. He never returned to Elkhorn. It was just after midnight when Mrs. Whittle lit a single oil lamp and slipped from the parsonage into the cold. The November wind scraped the shutters and rattled the church's front doors, but she had the spare key in her apron pocket. She told herself it was only to pray. In truth, her hands were shaking with a different intention. Inside, the air was damp, the kind of damp that doesn't come from rain, but from something seeping upward. The pews stood like silent witnesses in the moonlight spilling through the stained glass. She made her way to the reverend's office, avoiding the creak of the floorboards she'd learned over years of cleaning. The key to the iron cabinet was gone. She hadn't expected it to be there, but the ledger was not what she had come for this time. Her lamp's glow caught something in the far corner of the office, a section of wall where the wainscoting didn't match the rest. The wood here was newer, but faint stains had already begun to seep through, dark and irregular. She pressed her ear to it. At first, she heard nothing. Then so faint she thought it might be her imagination came the sound of breathing. Not labored, not hurried, but steady, as if someone were standing just inches away on the other side. Her skin crawled. She backed away and nearly dropped the lamp when a voice, soft, high, and unmistakably that of a child, whispered through the wood, "It's not locked anymore." The flame sputtered. Behind her, the nave of the church seemed darker than it had been a moment ago. She turned, but there was no one there. Mrs. Whittle fled into the night without closing the door behind her. The reverend never asked why. The people of Elkhorn liked to pretend they didn't gossip, but in truth, word traveled faster in the mountains than in any city street. By late winter, enough letters had been sent and enough replies received to paint a troubling picture of where the Weavers had come from. Before Elkhorn, they had lived for barely 6 months in a place called Marrow Glen, 40 miles east. The letter from its postmaster was polite but strained, as if each word had been chosen carefully. He mentioned that the Weavers left quietly after certain local tragedies, and that it would be wise to be mindful if they'd brought the youngest boy with them. No details, no names. Before that, there was Renford, a coal town that barely existed anymore. The man who replied to the inquiry there was less cautious. He wrote of 2 missing children, both last seen near an abandoned mining shaft. He wrote of the sheriff organizing a search party, only for the sheriff himself to vanish, and he wrote one more thing, a detail so specific that it could not be ignored. Both missing children, he said, were found in old town records dated decades before their births, with their names already written there. In every place the Weavers left the same way. No goodbyes, no explanations, just gone before anyone could confront them. And now in Elkhorn, the pattern was already taking shape. Caleb Dunn's name could have been written somewhere, years before he was born. Sheriff Caldwell's too. No one knew for certain, but the Reverend had stopped locking the ledger in the cabinet. He now kept it in his desk drawer, within arm's reach during every sermon. His eyes lingered on Thomas Weaver more often, as if waiting for a moment that would either confirm or end the nightmare. By January, the mountains around Elkhorn had turned to white walls. Snow piled high enough to bury fence posts, and the river froze in jagged plates. Winter in these hills was always harsh, but that year it carried a sharper edge. as if the cold were driving something up from the earth instead of pressing it down. Tracks began to appear in the snow near Cradle's End. Not deer, not bear. The prints were bare human feet, small, like a child's, walking in perfect, measured lines from the hollow toward the ridge. No one claimed them, no one followed them far. The deeper you went, the quieter the world became, until even the sound of your own breath seemed muted. On the coldest night of the season, the town's miller, Jonah Pike, swore he saw lanterns bobbing near the clearing, 4 of them moving in unison, their light too steady for men walking over snow. The next day he found no footprints, no burned wicks, only a patch of snow melted down to the dead, black leaves beneath. Thomas Weaver was seen more often now, wandering alone through the drifts without leaving a trail behind him. Some said it was a trick of the wind. Others swore they saw the snow close itself over his path as he walked. At night, the people nearest the church claimed they could hear a low, rhythmic thumping from deep underground, like something vast and slow turning in its sleep. The Reverend insisted it was the frozen river shifting in the cold, but Mrs. Whittle, pale and thinner than she'd been a month before, told a different story to a neighbor she trusted. "It's not the river," she whispered. "It's knocking, and one night soon, it's going to knock back." The thaw hadn't come yet, but the river ice had begun to shift, not breaking, just groaning under its own weight. On a late afternoon in February, 2 boys cutting across the frozen shallows near the old mill stopped dead in their tracks. Beneath the cloudy surface, caught in a seam of ice no thicker than a pane of glass, was a face. A boy's face. The features were pale and blurred, as if pressed just under the ice, eyes closed, lips slightly parted. The current beneath him swirled sluggishly, catching strands of dark hair that waved like grass in the wind. The boys screamed for help. By nightfall, half the town stood on the banks with lanterns, peering down at the shape. At first, everyone assumed it was Caleb Dunn, but the miller swore it wasn't. Caleb had freckles. This boy's skin was flawless, almost waxen, and there was something else. His clothes were wrong. The shirt and trousers were stitched by hand in a style no one had worn in decades. The Reverend arrived last. He pushed through the crowd, knelt on the ice, and stared down for a long, terrible moment. Then, without touching the surface, he whispered to the men closest to him, "Do not break it, not tonight." Thomas Weaver was nowhere to be found during the commotion. But when the crowd finally dispersed, a single set of small, barefoot prints was seen leading from the riverbank toward the hill. By morning, the shape beneath the ice was gone. No cracks, no melt, just the empty dark water under the frozen skin. Mrs. Dunn, who had lost Caleb, swore she heard a voice outside her window that night. A boy's voice, low and cold. "I told him you'd come looking." Jonah Pike was the kind of man who carried the town's stories in his head, the old births, the quiet deaths, the feuds no one wrote down. He was also the last person in Elkhorn willing to talk openly about Cradle's End. In early March, when the snow began to soften, Jonah told anyone who'd listen that the hollow was stirring. He'd been up there twice in the past week, and each time he'd found the altar stones scraped clean, as if something had been dragged across it. He spoke of shallow pits appearing where the soil had been undisturbed for years, each just wide enough for a small body. The night before he vanished, Jonah went door to door, urging the men of the town to go with him at first light, to fill in the pits and break the stone if they could. Only 2 agreed. They never got the chance. At dawn, Jonah's wife found his bed empty, the back door ajar. No footprints in the softening snow, just a damp, muddy trail leading into the woods behind their house. By midday, a crowd gathered at the church. The Reverend stood on the steps, telling them in a voice as calm as it was unnatural that the mountains take back what belongs to them. He offered no prayer for Jonah's safe return. That evening, Thomas Weaver was seen again in the graveyard. He had something clenched in his hand, small and dark. A neighbor swore it was Jonah Pike's wedding band. When asked where he got it, Thomas only said, "He's singing now. You can hear him if you go to the stone." No one went that night. Not even the ones who half believed him. It was a windless night when the church bell rang on its own. The sound pulled Reverend Whittle from bed, his nightshirt damp with cold sweat. He lit a lantern, crossed the empty nave, and froze at the sight of his office door standing open. The ledger lay on his desk, not in the locked drawer where he'd left it, but open, pages fluttering as though an invisible hand were turning them. The air in the room smelled faintly of damp earth. and the flame of his lantern leaned toward the book as if drawn. The names filled the pages in the same looping script: births, disappearances, deaths, but they were not in chronological order. Some names were written twice, once with a date of birth, and once decades earlier, with notes like found again or returned unchanged. He turned another page and felt his stomach lurch. There was Jonah Pike's name entered in the same dark ink as Thomas Weaver's, with the date 1831 beneath it, 43 years before Jonah was even born. The next page made his hands go cold. There were more names, each belonging to someone in Elkhorn, each with two entries, one from long ago and one from the present year. And at the bottom, in ink so fresh it gleamed under the lantern, was his own. Beside it a note: "We'll hear the knocking, we'll open the door." The Reverend slammed the book shut, but the sound echoed too loudly, as if the room itself were smaller than before. Somewhere under the floorboards came that slow, heavy thump once, twice, 3 times. He left the church without extinguishing the lamp, the light spilling across the altar like a warning no one would heed. At first, the knocking was something you only heard if you stood in the church after dark. A deep, slow rhythm, like an enormous hand pressing on the beams beneath the floor. But by the end of March, the sound began to travel. Mrs. Dunn heard it first in her kitchen, 3 dull thuds beneath the flagstone floor, so strong her teacup rattled in its saucer. She thought it was a mole until the knocks came again, heavier this time and in perfect intervals. By the next week, others claimed to hear it in their barns, their bedrooms, even out in the open fields. Always 3 knocks, always the same slow, patient tempo. It was the blacksmith, Elias Hart, who made the mistake of answering. One night, the knocks came from just under his bed. He rapped back with the heel of his boot, 3 sharp strikes. The sound stopped only for something to knock again from inside the wall behind his headboard. By morning, Elias was gone. His wife swore she'd been awake all night, sitting beside the bed, never hearing a door open or footsteps leave. The only sign was the smell, a damp, earthen scent, as if fresh soil had been scattered across the room. The Reverend told the town to stay silent if the knocking came, but Thomas Weaver, when asked about it, only smiled and said, "It's just asking to be let in. Some of you already have." No one knew what he meant, but that night 6 homes heard the sound, and in one of them, the abandoned Pike house, the knocks went on until dawn. By mid-April, the snow was gone, but the ground around Cradle's End stayed wet, as if something beneath it was pushing water upward. The laurel bushes that had always grown thick around the hollow now flowered weeks too early, their white blooms curling inward like clenched fists. Hunters noticed other changes. The air was warmer there, heavy with a smell like rotting fruit. The moss on the altar stone had turned a deep, bruised purple, and new carvings had appeared, not fresh cuts, but shallow grooves so worn they seemed centuries old. Yet no one remembered seeing them before. Children from the far end of town began talking about the spring game. They claimed that if you went to the hollow at dusk and sat with your back to the stone, you'd hear voices naming people in the town. Sometimes it was the name of someone alive, sometimes someone long dead. One boy said he heard his own name spoken twice, once in a high child's voice and once in a low, wet whisper. He never went back, but his mother said he started waking in the night, walking barefoot to the edge of the woods and standing there until morning. The Reverend avoided the subject in his sermons, but his wife noticed him staring at the altar cloth as if expecting something to rise beneath it. When she pressed him, he only said, "It's blooming early this year. That's never good." On the last Sunday of the month, Thomas Weaver arrived at church with a single laurel bloom tucked into his buttonhole. It was the same bruised purple as the moss on the stone. It happened on the first warm night of the year. No storm, no wind, just the heavy stillness of spring settling over Elkhorn. But by morning, every house in town had the same story. The windows had all been opened. In the homes where the sashes had been nailed shut for decades, the nails were neatly placed on the sills. In the locked ones, the latches were still fastened, but the panes swung outward as if the glass itself had decided to move. Nothing had been stolen. No doors were forced. Yet each family swore they had woken sometime between midnight and 3 to the same sensation. Cold air pouring in, and the faint, distant smell of wet earth. One family said they saw footprints in the frost on their roof, small, bare, and leading to the window that faced the church. Another swore they woke to find a laurel bloom resting on the nightstand, in between them. The worst story came from the schoolteacher, Miss Hale. She claimed she woke to find Thomas Weaver standing at her window inside her room. His hands rested lightly on the sill, his eyes calm. When she asked what he was doing there, he only said, "They just wanted to see you. I'll tell them you're ready." Miss Hale moved out of town within the week. The Reverend tried to calm the panic, insisting it was the work of pranksters. But in private, Mrs. Whittle saw him packing a small leather bag and sliding the iron cabinet key onto its cord once more. The church was fuller than it had been in months. People who hadn't attended since Christmas now sat in the pews, stiff and pale. They weren't there for scripture, they were there because whispers said the Reverend was going to finally say it. From the pulpit, Reverend Whittle began in the usual way, a reading from Corinthians, a reminder of charity. But then his voice shifted. It grew low, deliberate. The windows open because they are invited, not by you, not by me, but by the thing you all pretend you cannot see, the thing beneath the hollow that wears a boy's skin. A few gasps, a cough. No one left. He spoke of the altar stone as if it were a mouth, of the laurel blooms as offerings, of the naming game the children played, which he called a census, taken by something older than the town. His eyes searched the crowd until they fell on Thomas Weaver. The boy sat calmly in the front pew, hands folded, head tilted in polite attention. "It's not him," the Reverend said. "It never was. He's just what it wears to walk among us, and it will keep wearing him until we decide whose turn is next." The congregation shifted uneasily. When the sermon ended, no one spoke. The Reverend walked back to the parsonage without shaking a single hand. That night his home stood dark, but in the morning the iron cabinet was found open, the key gone, and his bed unslept in. The only thing left on his desk was a single bruised laurel bloom pressed between the pages of his Bible. It began with the church bell ringing at an hour it shouldn't, 2 chimes after midnight. No one claimed to have pulled the rope, yet every household felt the summons. By lamplight they gathered, some in nightclothes, some clutching coats against the chill. The air carried that same wet earth smell from the night of open windows, heavier now, almost metallic. At the front of the crowd stood Thomas Weaver. He didn't speak, didn't gesture, he simply turned and began walking toward Cradle's End. The townsfolk followed without discussion, like parishioners in a funeral march. The hollow looked different in the moonlight. The trees were too still, their leaves unmoving despite a wind they could hear but not feel. The path wound deeper than most had ever gone. Mrs. Whittle whispered a prayer. A boy of 8 began humming under his breath, the same strange tune Thomas had once whistled on the school steps. Others picked it up unconsciously. At the center of Cradle's End lay a ring of laurel blooms, each one fresh despite the season. In the middle was the altar stone. Its surface seemed to breathe, not visibly, but with a presence you could feel pressing against your lungs. Thomas climbed onto it and finally spoke. "They've been patient, too patient, but they're ready now." Some people turned to leave but found the path behind them swallowed by darkness, as if the hollow had sealed itself shut. The last thing anyone remembered clearly was Thomas raising his arms as though introducing the crowd to something behind them. In the morning, the hollow was empty. Spring came without laughter, no jump, rope songs in the dirt lanes. No paper kites tangled in the trees. The schoolhouse stood open, desks gathering dust, the blackboard still bearing a half-aced lesson from the week before the procession. There were no children left to sit in those desks, not a single one. Parents didn't speak of it openly. They referred to it as the quiet, as though naming it would call it back. But in private, their grief took strange shapes. Cradles left rocking by invisible hands, meals cooked for absent mouths, toys left on porches for no one to claim. Sheriff Dale rode out to Cradle's End twice, both times returning pale and silent. He kept a shotgun behind his desk afterward, but never explained why. Reverend Whittle's church, though leaderless, filled every Sunday. Sermons were read aloud from the Bible by whoever could bear it, but the scripture felt thin, powerless against the weight that now hung over them. Whispers spread that a few children had been seen on the outskirts of town at dusk. Not running, not calling for help, just standing in the tree line, watching, always at the same distance, as though some invisible tether held them there. And Thomas Weaver, Some swore he was among them, older somehow, taller, his eyes catching the moonlight like glass. Others claimed he had never left the hollow, that his voice was what they heard in the wind on sleepless nights. That year, no babies were born. The midwife's hands went idle, and the town cemetery took in more than it gave back. It was as if the town's future had been erased in a single night. In 1938, a WPA archivist named Lowell Drayton was sent to inventory forgotten county records in West Virginia. Among moldy ledgers and tax receipts, he found a narrow wooden box sealed with black wax. Inside was a stack of brittle cloth-bound notebooks. Each was written in the same careful hand Thomas Weaver's. The earliest entries were simple weather notes, sketches of birds, copied Bible verses. But as the months passed, the writing became erratic, the ink darker, the margins crowded with symbols no linguist has since identified. The final notebook stopped mid-sentence. They are not beneath the ground, as the old stories claim. The ground is beneath them. Tucked between the last pages was a pressed laurel bloom perfectly preserved, fragrant as if it had been plucked that morning. Beneath it, in a child's scrawl, was a date, August 14, 1875, exactly 1 year after the night the children vanished. Drayton did not include the box in his official report. He took it home instead. His neighbors later said they saw him carrying it into the woods one evening, muttering to himself. He never came back. The box was found 2 weeks later, resting on the altar stone in Cradle's End. Inside was a single fresh notebook. Its first page read, "I was wrong, they are patient still." The rest of the pages were blank. To this day, no record exists of Thomas Weaver in the census, school rosters, or church logs, as though the boy had been a story. The town told itself until it began to believe it. And yet, on certain autumn nights, in hollows where the wind won't stir, people swear they hear a child humming that strange, slow tune.